My name is Kent Bai, and I do the Voices of VR podcast, and I'm going to be talking to you today about some design patterns for the experiential age, what you should know about virtual reality and augmented reality. So since May of 2014, I've gone to over 30 different conferences and done over 750 interviews with some of the leading pioneers of both virtual and augmented reality. And at the end of every interview, I ask them, what do you think is the ultimate potential of virtual reality? And when I look at their answers tend to be into one of these 12 different domains of human experience. And I think some of the biggest ones where VR is coming up originally is with entertainment, obviously with gaming, but there's also a huge social component there. We're connecting to your friends and family. But there's a lot of enterprise applications with medicine, with taking for architecture, engineering, design, and visualization, but also education, both for early education, but also like higher education, travel, spirituality. And it's changing our sense of our identity and who we are. And there's new ecosystems for virtual goods that's emerging as well. So this is kind of like the big landscape view of the patterns that I've seen emerge after talking to all these people in VR. And the way that I talk about it is that we're moving from the information age to the experiential age. And so what does that mean? I've said that a lot, and I think in this talk today, I'm going to be talking a little bit more specifics about what I mean exactly, that we're moving from one age to the next. So I'll give you first a little bit of a historical context for virtual reality, go into a little bit of the elemental theory of presence that I've come as kind of like a framework for experiential design, and then we'll talk about some of the experiential age qualities. So if we go all the way back, like 26,000 years, we see the early beginnings of communication, and it's visual and immersive. You can imagine going into a cave, just having maybe a fire or light there and being completely immersed, not seeing anything else, and you see these images. And this was the early beginnings of visual communication, but eventually we move from that to hieroglyphics, where we start to have some symbols and abstracted ways of communicating. And from that, we have another level of abstraction, such that you break down each of the words into individual letters, and then you're able to communicate thoughts and ideas in a completely new way. And so for me, when I think about the history of media, I kind of think it in these terms of the left brain and the right brain. As soon as we had the introduction of these abstracted ways of communicating with language and the alphabet, we moved more primarily from a left brain way of thinking rather than a right brain. And what I see in the experiential age is kind of like a return to that right brain. But specifically, I'm using left brain, right brain as a high-level metaphor. So on one side, the left brain is very objective and quantitative, and the right brain is very subjective, it's qualitative. So with the printing press, we had this democratization of information and knowledge, and it really set this mass publication of being able to capture information and distribute it all over the world. And this was what, in a large part, spurred the Renaissance as well as the Enlightenment period. So we have this emphasis of the left brain from like the last 500 years. So with Descartes, he had this literal split between the mind and the body, where he saw that these were actually two different things, and we kind of see this split of the left brain and the right brain. And so Rick Tarnas, in his book Passion of the Western Mind, as well as Cosmos and Psyche, he talks about this split as almost like the beginning of a hero's journey, where, with Joseph Campbell, he says that there's three major stages of the hero's journey. There's the separation, the ordeal, or the initiation, and then the return. So we're kind of in the middle of a 500-year cycle of an ordeal. What Tarnas describes as this, on one hand, unending technological progress, but on the other hand, we have this spiritual and ecological crisis. So both of these are happening at the same time, and depending on where you're focusing on, you could see evidence for both. For the technological progress, we see this unending sort of exponential growth of innovation when it comes to technology. But also, when you talk about the spiritual growth, we sort of have this evolution of man who is very embodied, but then is becoming more and more disembodied the more we get involved with, kind of this iteration of 2D technology. We're also in the midst of this ecological crisis where a lot of our practices of what we're doing in technology may not necessarily be the most sustainable. This idea of unending growth may be kind of an artifact of an abstraction of the mind. So what I see is that there's this kind of the split between the objective and the subjective, the mind and the body, and the science and spirit that we are still kind of in the midst of resolving. So if we kind of skip forward to the latest iteration of a lot of the technologies in this century, we could see that going back to the 1890s time period, there's kind of like this explosion of a lot of electricity, power lines. We have a lot of the electromagnetic waves that led to both radio and television. And at its core, we have the return of the image. Rather than just a text, we have the return of both the moving image, photography, film, cinema, and it's starting to kind of usher in this return to experience. And then with computers, we kind of take it to the next level where you're able to actually engage and interact. And so 1962, we have Ivan Sutherland, who created some of the first interactive design when it comes to the 3D user, or he's the sketchpad, where he's actually creating a pen and engaging with a computer that goes beyond just text. He's starting to actually draw. And then Ivan Sutherland, he wrote the Ultimate Display in 1965, and then in 1968, he created one of the first virtual reality headsets. And at that same time is when the first signals for the ARPANET got sent, so we have the beginnings of the internet that was going back to the 60s. And then we have the personal computer revolution that started with Apple. And then in 1983, we have gaming. So a lot of the Nintendo people start to express their agency and participate in a new way. And then in 1989, we have the Game Boy. So we have this taking what was sit down and tethered in front of a TV, you now have disconnected and you're untethered and you're now doing mobile computing for the first time. And I'd say that the Game Boy kind of led, and then in between there, in 1993, we have this explosion of the World Wide Web, so the internet is starting to take place. We have the BlackBerry 1999, so people starting to communicate at any moment. It's sort of blurring the lines between what is work and not work. You're able to communicate and write emails at any moment. Then we have the iPhone 2007 that is kind of connecting you to the internet and having this new tablet interface. And then 2012 to 2016, we have this emergence of both virtual and augmented reality. So we're actually being immersed into the technology. So you see this long movement of the computer and technology that's getting us more and more immersed into experience, not just information. And so because we're able to completely hack all of our senses and basically fool our minds into believing that we're in this other world, it brings us to this question like, what is reality? If you're able to trick my mind into believing this synthetic reality is real, then what is the base reality that we're all living in? And so what I see is that all of this technology taken together is that we're moving from a left brain bias into a right brain, more subjective, more qualitative. If you think about artificial intelligence, for example, a lot of machine learning, you're giving machines an experience of data, and so it's making subjective judgments. You're no longer writing the algorithm, you're kind of giving a computer an experience that's sort of curated by a human, but that computer is now kind of making those similar types of judgments that humans used to make. So a lot of our technology is moving into this more subjective, qualitative world. The other thing that's huge is this idea of embodied cognition, and that's to say that we don't just think in our brains. We think with our entire bodies, but also our environments that we're in, such that when you are in this environment here and you're back, maybe maybe a month or maybe 2 years later, you may remember this time that you spent here, because whenever we're in a physical location, that's triggering our memories in a certain way. So the principle of embodied cognition is huge, because what it means is that you can start to design spaces that are triggering certain ways of thinking. And in the level of immersion that you're having, it's actually changing the way that we think. So this is a graphic that kind of demonstrates this at the highest level is like the text and abstraction. And as you get further and further down, we have pictures and audio recordings, motion pictures, and then we get into like more experiential things where you're actually going on field trips. So the big thing here is that you're actually engaging all of your sensory experience when you go on a field trip or you have a direct experience. It's including your body in a completely new way. And so what I see is that whereas we've had this mind-body split, we're actually, like with virtual reality and augmented reality technologies, it's actually kind of bringing those back together into some sort of convergence. because you have to start to think about, when you're doing experiential design, it requires this level of holistic thinking where you have to think about the whole picture. If you're designing an experience, you have to think about the environment, the music, the emotional engagement. And so after going through over 1,500 experiences and talking to over 750 people over the last couple of years, I started to find that there was different levels of presence that I was feeling. And I have this framework here called the emotional, it's the elemental theory of presence, where these 4 different types of presence. And I'm basing it on this kind of Neoplatonic way of thinking about in terms of the elements. So if we talk about the things that we've had already for a long time, the air element is very mental presence, but it's also have a lot of social presence. So you're able to actually feel like you're hanging out with people in a way that you actually feel like you're co-present. Active presence is your expression of agency and interacting within the experience. And we see this with video games. You're able to actually engage and interact. The embodied presence is something that is completely new to virtual reality, where you're actually bringing your direct sensory experience into technology. And I think there's a lot of implications of what that means. And I'll be kind of diving into each of these. The emotional presence, I think, is something that is probably the least understood and least well considered, but if you look at the medium of film as kind of engaging your emotions, that's a good way to kind of think about that. But I'll be diving into each of these here. So gaming is kind of the essence of the air and fire element. You're making choices and decisions, but you're also expressing your agency within the experience in some way. And so gaming is mostly about you going through making choices and decisions and exerting your will into the experience. Film is much more passive and receptive. And when you dial down one of the levels of presence, you can increase other levels of presence. And so when you see a film, it's mostly about hearing a story that's going to engage some part of your emotions in some way. And in virtual reality, this is bringing in the body into technology and computing for the first time. So let me just go through some of the different, in terms of experiential design, some of the considerations, as well as like where this is going. So active presence is all about agency. How are you able to interact and participate in some way? So it's a lot of the gameplay and mechanics and interactions. And I think that as we move further and further into the future of technology, we're going to see a lot more, I guess, gamification or increased amount of people participating into experiences. You're not going to just be passively receiving, but it may be a little bit more like you're engaging in a D&D role-playing game where the narrative have a big part of your participation in that process. But it's moving from abstracted expressions of agency into natural and intuitive expressions. And so you're moving your body, and you have the return of skeuomorphism, which if you want to open a door, you have a doorknob there. So having those different affordances within an experience tells your user what you're able to actually do. So you're moving away from these abstractions of 2D interfaces, and we have to kind of figure out what is a 3D user interface. What does it mean to use multimodal interfaces and tablets, and what we have existing with keyboards? Or are there going to be corded keyboards, or is it going to be conversational interfaces? So conversational interfaces is a new way of expressing our agency. It used to be that the only way that you could participate in a video game was pushing buttons, but what does it mean now that you can actually talk to your characters? That's going to introduce all sorts of new diplomatic gameplay, but also where you're kind of pretending or lying, or you have to determine if other people are lying, but you're able to actually engage with non-player characters in a completely new way. And I think creation tools is something that we're seeing a lot of in terms of actually being in VR and being able to actually create either 3D art. If you're creating an experience, you have to ask yourself, how are you going to allow the users to be able to actually participate and express their agency and will within the experience? Because they're not going to just want to passively receive it. They want to actually be in the process of creating the content. And I think that if we look at the trajectory of what's happening in technology, we have more and more live streaming where you have to see it and be there in the moment. And we're moving away from things that are recorded. I mean, you can still see all sorts of stuff online, but live streaming, but also live performance, live theater, immersive theater. We have this confluence of immersive theater and technology that is also happening right now. So peripherals essentially means that new ways of you expressing your agency. Whenever you have a peripheral within a VR experience, it's telling you that you have this tool that you're able to use within the experience. And by having your hands on these tools, it actually changes your way that you think about things. So that as a dynamic interaction there, thinking about these new peripherals that we have in these immersive experiences. And interactive learning is, I went to an Embodied Cognition workshop at an academic conference, and the thing they said is that a learning experience, a good learning experience is the same principles as a good, basic VR experience. And I would argue that these 4 levels of presence kind of is a framework for thinking about how do you create a good experience. But we're moving away from didactic reception of knowledge and information, and it's going to be much more interactive, where you're actually engaging within the environment, and it's going to be you going around and walking in an interactive museum to be able to kind of learn about how the world works. So the social and mental presence, the big thing about the mental presence is that you have to believe the scene that you're seeing, and so the scene has to have a certain amount of coherence. Otherwise, you're going to be kind of tripped out of the level of presence. So like if you're in a movie and there's a plot hole, and so all of a sudden you're kind of pulled out of the experience. That can happen in VR, where the 2 key components of presence in VR is the place illusion and the plausibility illusion. And as soon as you don't believe that experience is plausible, you're out, and it's going to be difficult to regain that level of plausibility. So the uncanny valley is a huge challenge when it comes to interacting with non-player characters, because we have such a refined way of detecting human emotion, and such that it essentially we can tell the difference if something's real or not real. And the uncanny valley is going to be much more important in terms of how do you make things stylized or dial down the level of fidelity such that it's more believable that you're interacting with these either artificial intelligent characters or other characters that are actual humans but don't have something on their face that makes it look creepy or unreal. And game designers, they talk about mental friction in terms of the challenges that you are actually mentally engaged, puzzles within experiences. Natural language processing is a huge part with artificial intelligence, of course, so we're going to see a lot more being able to use your full language in order to engage with these technologies. AI, machine learning, you have to train AI, so you have to capture all this data, but with that, you're going to have this sense of the more that we study AI, the more that we learn about what it means to be intelligent. Just like the more that we study VR, the more we learn about what it means to be present and to be human. And so I think both of these, artificial intelligence and VR, are experiential technologies that are kind of mirrors as to reflecting back to us what it means to be human. So making choices, in actual plausible choices. So there's a lot of the narratives that are out there such that they're authored and pre-configured such that they're branching. And when you make choices, you kind of want to make a choice that actually has consequence. And so this gets back to the fire element as to whether or not you have local agency or global agency within an experience, meaning the choices that you're making, do they have consequence to the outcome? Or are you just giving a choice to maybe flavor your experience, but not actually mean anything? So, so having a combination of both local and global agency, I think, is going to be a thing that people are going to be looking for, not just sort of choices that don't really matter. So education is going to be huge in terms of it's going to change the way that we learn. But there's some people that are going to take these virtual reality technologies and completely enhance the way that they think. So to me, that this starts to get into biofeedback and being more aware of what's happening in your body. And with neuroscience, we have this brain computer interfaces where they're either going to be invasive or non-invasive. I'm personally a little skeptical about the limits to which we can do completely invasive, using your brain to communicate with technology. I think we're going to start with non-invasive and kind of push that to the edge, but I think we're going to find that we're going to need our entire bodies in order to really think and process, and that we're not going to be able to hack the brain and inject neural code into our brains. And then if you could, would you want to open your brain up to that level of vulnerability? I don't know if I would. So let's just move on to embodied experience. So we have, this is in all of your sensory perception, so your eyes, and virtual reality, augmented reality, especially VR, is all about trying to hack those senses and to make you feel like you're in another world. And the thing about when you feel like you're identifying with your body and your character in VR is called the virtual body ownership illusion. And when you do that, you can make it feel like you're identifying with you can be a robot with an extra arm. And so you're going to be able to actually extend the amount of senses that you have. But the principle of embodied cognition is really huge because it's making you realize that we're using our entire body to think, and when you're designing experiences, you have to try to figure out how are you actually engaging the body and the senses. Haptics, this is something that I feel like we have the sight and the hearing and the actual feel of touch is something that is probably the most that is lacking. Like, you don't believe that you're actually in another world because it takes a lot to trick our bodies, but just low-level haptics is enough to convince your mind that extra level, especially if you have passive haptic feedback where you're actually holding guns. Sensory replacement is this idea that we're going to be able to actually create new senses so that David Eagleman has this vest where it has all these different buzzers that are buzzing on your body, and they could put this on someone who is deaf and basically send the same signal that your cochlea would into your brain. And as long as you're able to visually see that connection, you can essentially turn your torso into an ear. So the idea is that you're going to be able to send a lot of data and information into your body, and if you see a correlation, your brain eventually is going to be able to figure it out, which I think is, to me, the question is, well, what kind of data would you want to do? What kind of new senses do we want to start to put and figure out? Biometric data is probably the biggest concern in terms of privacy, because this is the thing that is all of our unconscious thinking. So that once if we allow our biometric data and all of these eye tracking, our EMGs, our heart rate, galvanic skin response, all these things are basically unconscious things that our body is doing. And the more that companies are having access to that, the more they're going to be able to hack our consciousness and be able to essentially control us in different ways. And so on the one hand, it's going to be able to allow us to know so much more information about ourselves and our bodies, but at the same time, there's huge privacy risks here. And body language and the sense of place are two other things that I think are going to be a lot more important when it comes to engaging in these new environments. And the last one here that I'll go through is the emotional presence, which, again, like I said, is probably the least well understood, but it's a lot about the narrative and character and colors that are evoking different emotions. Music is a huge emotional part of any experience, and that can take you back to a time and place. And so it's all about creating a sense of ambiance of an experience. And so what kind of emotions are you trying to create? Whenever you're designing immersive experiences, you have to think about the environment and the colors. And once we get to facial tracking and be able to convey emotions to each other, we're going to eventually be able to feel like we're actually with other people. Because we don't have that yet, we have this gap between the level of emotional fidelity that you can communicate in VR. But once we have facial tracking, it's going to sort of take it to that next level. You hear people talk about VR as an empathy machine. It triggers our mirror neurons in a way that actually makes us more empathetic. And I think that there's a connection between our emotions and memory, as well as like our symbols and intuition, like the collective unconscious and our soul. They're kind of, again, all these things are a little bit more into the more esoteric realm, but they're a part of our experience that we're not always necessarily completely conscious about. So these are the four major different types of presence that as I go through different experiences, I start to see these different patterns. And I feel like this is a little bit like a framework for experiential design. And after I've talked about all of this in the abstract in terms of moving from the information age to the experiential age, I think if you look at these metaphors, you can kind of see like I'm kind of talking about getting information from books and then moving from what's it mean to have computers, gaming, the internet, mobile gaming, 2D tablet interfaces, as well as immersive technologies. All of these together are kind of forming this new experiential age, which you can start to see these different shifts in our culture. And if I were to try to, I've got 2 slides here where I go through these different things. We're moving from something that is, I think both of these are happening at the same time. I think that's important to remember. But at the same time, I also think we're kind of like moving as a center of our culture, we're kind of moving more into the subjective rather than the objective, more right-brained and left-brained. If you think about quantum physics as a metaphor, something as kind of isolated as a particle, but yet we're kind of moving into this interconnected wave. So moving away from reductionistic thinking and more into like thinking about things holistically. And linearity of storytelling and that we're experiencing is going to be much more interactive and nonlinear. It's going to be much more like being in an immersive theater where you're able to actually participate and engage with the characters, and it's going to be more like LARPing or role-playing. So we're moving away from the passive. So the 2 major presence from the information age is mental and emotional presence, and we're going to have both the social, embodied, and active presence. So all the media we experienced before was very faded, but we're going to be moving into a world where we have much more ability to express our free will in different ways. So it used to be like theater of the mind. You would read a book and you'd have to construct it in your mind, but we're moving it to where you actually you're immersed in the experience, and your kind of unconscious brain is believing that you're really in another world. And I think we're moving away from things that are scripted, written down, and it's going to be authentic and kind of emergent in the moment. And I think we see this within live streamers who are authentically reacting in the moment to whatever they're playing. And so while the previous ways of communicating was one-to-many, I think it's going to be much more participatory. So we're going to have ways of engaging everybody within the experience. And then finally, this is the last things that I'll go through here. We're moving from something that used to be asynchronous, but something that is live streamed. Again, whenever we look at narratives and stories, that was very authored, but I think that being able to actually have the story emerge based upon your emergent behavior is going to be a thing that we're going to look much more like Dungeons and Dragons than something that is completely authored. With a lot of these existing technologies, we have a 2D frame that's completely being broken, and we have these immersive spatial experiences. And a lot of our technology has been us exerting our will through conscious behavior, but it's going to be much more unconscious, like looking at our eye tracking and what our body's actually doing. And so our reactions aren't going to be necessarily above our conscious awareness, which for people who are designing experiences have an ethical responsibility to take care of that. Instead of consuming products, we're going to be much more focused on having experiences. It's not going to be about owning things. It's going to be having access to the information. And like Spotify or Netflix, you don't own all those things, but you have an experience of those things. I think I see things with technology, it's moving from centralized power into these decentralized, serverless architectures. I think there's been a strong emphasis of competition, but within the open source community, I think we're going to see a lot more cooperation, which means that rather than a monolithic culture, we're going to have more about cultivating ecosystems. And when you watch a movie nowadays, you don't watch it on Blu-ray, you probably watch it on Netflix. So it's not about the fidelity, it's about having instant access. And it used to be information gatekeepers, but now anybody can just publish whatever they want. And so it's like this liberation of publication on all dimensions. And we're in this kind of mindset of unsustainable growth, and I think we're going to be moving into an awareness of cycles of seasons within the flow of life. And with that, I think we have this physical scarcity that we have in our real world, but as we move into a digital world, we're going to have this abundance where it's going to create new ways of interacting with each other and much more gift economy type of situations. So that, to me, that's kind of like an overview from the information age to the experiential age. You can check out my latest podcast on the Voices of VR. I've published over 540 episodes up to this point and have another 200 in my backlog to get through. I'm also working on a book called The Ultimate Potential of Virtual Reality, where I'll be kind of expanding on a lot of these a lot more with specific quotes and more examples. So I just wanted to thank you for your attention today, learning about moving from the information age to the experiential age. Thank you.